Well, good afternoon, friends. I'm Reverend Jeffrey Moore. This is Reverend Heather Goddess Moore. We're pastors at St. Stephen United Methodist, and we're glad to welcome you to our latest episode of Face to Face with Racism, having conversations face to face about covert forms of racism and white supremacy, how we can identify those, and how we can work to unmask them and, in fact, decentralize and take the power out of those. So we're very glad to have two distinguished guests from the SMU community. I'll let them introduce themselves as they speak, Herbert Coleman and Bart Patton. Today, our topic is prioritizing white voices as experts, and both of these guests have experienced this in their lives, and so I'll let them introduce themselves and give us some opening thoughts. Herbert, we'll start with you.
Heather and Jeff, I think I have some prepared statements, but first of all, thank you for even this opportunity to participate in St. Stephen's United Methodist Church and your efforts through Face to Face with Racism. Obviously, I'm certainly not an expert on this subject today, prioritizing white voices as experts, intersectionality of these racist behaviors with racism and classism. But I'm sure that I definitely live in, through, and with it every day of my Black life, and recognize and know racism for sure. I grew up in Ocala, Florida, towards the end of the civil rights era, and as some of those promises and legislations were just beginning to be enacted and lived out. Both of my parents, who were school educators and administrators, raised my sister and I in the Methodist tradition. And I've lived and served in the Northeast professionally in government, as well as in ministry, and was shaped further in ministry there. I've been here in Southwest Texas at SMU and Perkins for now 13 plus years, and presently serve as a director of retention and student success, and had my responsibilities expanded this past Thursday to also be the diversity officer for Perkins, in liaison work with other schools at SMU, and the chief diversity officer, a new appointment to SMU. That being said, let me attempt to frame my contributions today under a quadrilateral framework and theme of the following. This racism and white supremacy is not new. But as you are doing here at St. Stephen's, intentionally needs to be resurfaced, remembered, and understood communally in order that our actions towards dismantling racism and white supremacy foster resurrected trust towards justice in the church, nation, and world. Under that quadrilateral framework are the tenets of Scripture, from the liberation story of Exodus, beginning with chapter 1, verses 8 through 22, chapter 20, and then from the New Testament, James, chapter 1, verse 19. The tenet of tradition, through the Methodist lens of America, the 1770s, pre-Civil War, Reconstruction, 1939, 1968, unto today. The tenet of reason, as aided by Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And lastly, the tenet of experience, personal as well as communal. Although I haven't followed your efforts closely, I am hopeful and grateful to be a part of these forward-thinking and theological conversations and actions. Also might be helpful if we define what is meant by prioritizing white voices as experts.
Thank you, Herbert. I appreciate the Wesleyan framework, of course. Um, so that's a good question. I don't know, Bart, if you want to speak to that directly, or I can give some thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I'd love for you to share a little more. I feel like I am learning, and I feel like I am at the beginning phase of trying to take all of what we're talking about today and start to put that into good practice, specifically in the field of youth ministry. And I think there are probably a lot of parallels and similarities for what that looks like in a subculture of church ministry. So I'll be glad to hop on after you maybe further that out in a more broad sense.
Right. So I think that to me, it's on a continuum of, I mean, we've talked a lot about in these sessions about intersectionality. So when you're in a meeting with men and women at the table, and a woman says something and makes a suggestion that's passed over, and then later in the conversation, a male makes the same suggestion, and generally the males around the table say, "Oh, that's a good idea, let's do it." We've just prioritized the male voice as an expert and passed over the female voice and marginalized it. That's a kind of maybe small example. We could place a person of color and a person of white person. It could also be a matter of calling on, when we call on voices to speak on particular topics, or to give speeches, to present classes, to be teachers, to serve on faculty, to write editorials. Do we go to white voices first, or do we seek out voices of color? I'll give you another example that I experienced very recently by very well-intentioned people. I know every person involved in this. The intention was never to prioritize the white voice. I know this of these people, but the optics could not be denied. So I was attending a conference recently, and the subject happened to be musical. It was about singing. And so in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the conference planners decided to include a session, a breakout session on racism and singing in worship. So this was an hour-long session. It was a young white female and a young black female. Both of these women have done very good work and study in racism and justice, and they're both very committed to it. But the way that the session was structured, the white female spoke for the first 23 minutes of the hour, giving a very detailed presentation of terms and concepts and history with PowerPoint slides, etc., etc. She then turned it over to her colleague, who led a song for about 4 minutes. And then the conversation was passed back to the white female, who then spoke about very detailed concepts and philosophies and strategies and whatnot. Now, neither of these people intended to prioritize the white voice as an expert, but one, by the division of time, two, by the order of speaking, and three, by the subject matter. What was presented to, what the viewer saw was the white person is the expert on racism, and the contribution that the black person has to make is to lead a spiritual. Does that make sense? That is, again, absolutely unintentional, but the perception and then therefore what's communicated unconsciously is that the white voice is the expert, and the black voice is, in this case, the entertainment.
Well, Bart, we saw this this summer with our webinar series at Perkins, getting some feedback about the number of white voices we had. So it was the same type of thing where, you know, we do a lot of work and we try to broaden who it is that we bring in to speak to avoid those types of moments.
Absolutely. And it is an honor to be here, to be with you all, and I'm grateful for Herbert's remarks to get us started. I'm Bart Patton, and my work at Perkins is specifically to direct youth ministry, young adult ministry programs, and so tapping into expertise in those fields, I found exactly what you're speaking of, Jeffrey, and it was almost galvanized in this subculture, right, in this specialization field, because it is privilege that allows a subculture or a specialized field in the church to become its own area of expertise anyway. And so as I try to change who we bring in those expertise chairs and in those moments, it is really about decentralizing expertise entirely. It's really about attacking or thinking well about the moment and the voice. And so for me, it's been a conviction. And here's what I'll say about that. We typically, when we look for an expert, as to Jeffrey's point, we look for, and I've done it, you look for the true expert. You look for the education. You look for the, okay, who knows this? Who is the author? Or you look at relationships, friendships, someone that you can connect with within that. And so for me, my conviction in trying to not prioritize the whiteness in expertise was the realization when I came to Perkins that from the relational aspect, I needed to widen my circles. I needed to know more people, and I needed to know more about what they were doing. So that expert chair for me is changing to become to become a narrative seat, so that I know persons and I know their work, and so when I develop a narrative thread for an event, then I know who to tap into and whose voice to tap into, instead of just a default, I know this person and I know their work as an author, as a scholar, or as a quote unquote expert. So in a journey for planning events where we are at Perkins, those have been some of my convictions about broadening the circles of people that I know and knowing their stories and their contexts, and finding ways to sew their narratives into the greater narrative thread of our events, of our education, instead of just by default looking for the expert.
I love this idea of decentering expertise to begin with, because in the moment that you said that, I thought about, well, first of all, I thought about people who say, well, I'm not choosing the person because they're white. I'm choosing the person because they're an expert, right? Or because of their expertise. And I want to say, okay, expertise from whose perspective? It's like, Herbert, you mentioned all the intersectionality. It's like when someone says, and I read this in a post recently on Facebook, and I just wanted to pull my hair out, but this is why I keep my hair the way I do, so that I can't get a hold of it to pull it out. the person said, but if they are just articulate, that's just a, why can't I say someone's articulate if they are indeed articulate? That is a non-valued assessment. Articulate on whose authority, on whose scale, on whose standard of measurement. So decentering the whole idea of expertise to begin with. I love that. I'm gonna have to sit with that for a while. Herbert, I want to bounce back to you and see if you have any thoughts.
Well, hopefully it's not decentralization, as you have stated, that is not conscious of the representatives' community. Be that definitely constructive race, of which you all's efforts are towards, but be that theologically, sexuality-wise, and other means as well. There are a number of intersectionality that need to be considered in that. I do want to go back to, I think it was one of the first things you cited, that some of these efforts are not really covert. They are very intentional. And that's where that piece in Exodus, particularly in chapter 1, the shrewdness of the leadership may have been the ones to know of what they were doing, but it was felt on the other side as well. It was not covert, it was very intentional. And in light of this nation, there was intentionality from the beginning. With the Constitution, those who were present for that, moving it to the Methodist tradition, very similarly. In the 1770s, you see there's a picture in Methodism in which you see Francis Asbury being ordained, but there is one black face that is there. There was some intentionality that was present. We don't want to necessarily decentralize to the extent where we're not conscious of the audience to whom we are trying to reach and be of service with and to.
Yeah, I appreciate that admonition. Something you said in the middle of that made me think about a metaphor that Darnell St. Romain gave me in our community very early on in our conversation this summer when he came and spoke at St. Stephen. And he talked about whiteness being a blank page, and that his job as a black man was to figure out where he fit on the page. But whiteness is this blank page. And again, whether we're talking about being articulate, being an expertise, framing a church, framing a constitution, I mean, there's I don't want to deny that there is very overt intentionality at many times, but there's also this idea lurking in the background that for white people, that what I'm doing is like value neutral, that my perspective is value neutral, that my perspective is just normal, right? And so it can't be biased because it's value neutral. And that's what this blank page thing, just like, no, it's not value neutral. It has in fact defined the parameters from the beginning, and put certain people off the page, or out of the picture, as with Francis Asbury.
And I love that Herbert. I love that you drew us back to contextualization. That's. I mean, I was writing that down. I mean, that really is. that's huge for me to consider. You know, but that feeds so often. You know, we think, that this false dichotomy, right? That I can learn from the expert instead of learning from lived experience and from tradition and from value. That expertise can bypass. Maybe if I could just learn this from quote unquote the expert, then I don't have to do the work. And Jeffrey, to your point of
Mm.
drawing out my own bias,
Mm.
of drawing out, of paying attention. And Herbert, you use the intentionality there. Yeah, the context piece. That's I think that's big.
A lot of our audience is, they're not necessarily people who are planning events and bringing in experts to talk and things like that, or in an environment where they're seeing this happen around them, like we are. So I'm wondering if each of you can speak a little bit to what things ordinary people can be doing to help learn to prioritize a variety of voices instead of always going to their go-to white voices. Crickets. This goes a little bit to one of our members just asked a question about how do we prioritize voices of color? Is it simply that white voices step back and they relinquish their power, and so therefore voices of color can come forward, or is there something else to it? And so,
well, let me offer this. I noted James 1:19, which goes forward as such. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For anger does not produce God's righteousness. And I believe what we're trying to move forward, particularly through your efforts in face-to-face, is a more just and righteous living for ourselves, for our church, we've got these lights here, and for our nation and world.
it's that energy curtailment.
Yes. And I think about, at one point I was involved in the ordination process for North Texas. And it was very interesting that a requirement was to take a course that was entitled Anti-Racism, Dismantling Racism, something along those lines. They were very intentional about that. A part of that required of white ordinands to be quiet and listen to the stories that were, or the perspectives that were presented by experts from different racial, ethnic perspectives. Look at the history, the sociology of what other people, not just Black people, had to deal with, but Native Americans, Asian Americans. And it became it was very comforting to just have people listen to your story and perspective, as well as learn from the other perspectives that were being presented. However, towards the end of the day, there was a segment in which, yes, all voices can speak. And there was a numbness that seemed to come from my white counterparts there, to the extent that some were dismayed. And following that required event, made a appointment with the district superintendent to have a follow-up session. I became aware of this. I was not involved in it, but to have, and it was all just white ordination folks in that process, because of their dismay at having to be quiet, to just listen. And I say that towards prioritizing. Sometimes a listening partner as ally and presence can be powerful as we move forward together. Does that connect or make sense?
Yes, I'm trying to listen. What?
I don't know if Bart had some thoughts. He unmuted. So.
Years ago, and Herbert just said everything that I thought I wanted to say, like way better earlier. So thank you for reframing everything that I said and never thought. Years ago, I used to use building illustrations and metaphors in teaching and preaching, and I had been a tour guide in New York City for a while, and so I had this lesson on priorities, and from Matthew 6, right? Seek first the kingdom of God, right? And all these other things will be added. And the metaphor, the imagery that I used was planning as like city planners. And there were things that for city planners in major cities you just couldn't move. And so I met a city planner one time from New York City, and I said, that must be the coolest job in the world. And he said, no, it's boring. The best place to be a city planner would be Houston, because it's changing every single week, right? The zoning just changes, and so you get to redesign Houston every month. But you can't move the Empire State Building, and you can't move Central Park. And so, Herbert, as you were talking about, the long-term effects of what it means to prioritize something, is even in that listing, is it means to build those voices into the structure of your life. That's not a book that you read because of a particular moment. It's not a documentary that you watch because of something happening in culture in the moment. A prioritization should mean that those are voices we build into our lives, the routines and the rhythms of our lives.
Well, we have a lot more to talk about, and we will be doing that shortly in our backstage. We only began to unpack this conversation, and so as you start to think about the ways in which you could be better about prioritizing voices of color as your own experts, remember to be kind to yourself and give yourself grace, and know that we're all growing in this process toward being anti-racist. Just don't take your foot off the gas. We'll see you next week when we talk about something else. I don't remember what it is. Oh, we've got a book. Oh, this is the book that you talked about.
Oh, hold it up.
Hold it up. We'll Cast by Isabel. What's the last name?
Wilkerson.
Put it up a little bit higher. It's behind your name. Wilkinson. Wilkerson. We'll make sure that gets put on the backstage as well, so you can see that again. And we will see you next week.